Hello, this is part 7 of my notice to the Universal Postal Union, where I was reminding them of their authority and also invoking the power of the Universal Postal Union in asking them to abolish governments, certainly all the United Nations, World Economic Forum and World Health Organization, but also in our respective countries and how they have the authority to do that, what their position is. And also, what is most exciting and most immediate that I can tell you already before even they get round to reminding you, the people, is that our jurisdiction is far superior to corporations and governments. That is the case. Living men and women, far superior jurisdiction. Do you see how a mea culpa from the UPU would work like this to dispel the illusion of our subordination to all these financially motivated terrorists with their diplomatic immunity and admiralty law? So here I'm referring to the mea culpa, which is a self-blame decree, where you kind of say, look, this is my part and I'm sorry for that. I see what needs to be done now, and that then applies to all organisations under us. So that's what I've suggested the UPU, the Universal Postal Union, release. And they're dispelling the illusion that somehow we are subordinate, which we are not. Misplaced privilege has given mercenaries and merchant banking an extraordinary advantage over people. This is not least by giving them control of communications, both postal and digital. They have very nearly achieved ownership of men and women as slaves. The people who have attempted to contest, regulate, communicate their concerns, research or experience have been deprived of all means of doing so. This is why a basic postal service, which would merely meet their UPU's own universal service obligation, is a good place to start, as a remedy for the systemic attack on our jurisdiction. I really am glad that I can demand that the Post Office and the Postmaster General investigate the postal fraud, for example in the case of the red stamp. A red stamp, like a franking machine, remains uncancelled. Cancelling a stamp registers the matter and enters a contract between the party that cancels the stamp and the UPU. Using a stamp for postage and not cancelling it is prima facie evidence of a mail fraud, of taking people's money and not offering them the service they have paid for. In this notice and enclosed appeal, however, I have used the power of the cancel stamp by cancelling stamps myself. Delighted to enter this contract with the UPU and bring this matter for remedy under the provisions of the UPU, international law and treaty. Trafficking. We do not consent to the UN policy of migration as safe, orderly and regular. It destabilises sovereign nationals by necessitating their movement off their land and over the sea, where they have no jurisdiction, no standing and no state. Making people leave their property and security behind manufactures a dependence while breeding fear and making their lives precarious and open to abuse. The United Nations Army, which is not supposed to even exist, has been using maritime law to justify bringing trained soldiers into England and Ireland and all across the world. They are brought in boats from the continent from which they must be rescued, and they are given homes, papers, a job in the police for a vote and indeed a right to stand for election. Once the men are dropped off, the boats are shipped back to fill with more military trained migrants. Many of the millions of real refugees are stuck at borders, sometimes for years, and subjected to violence of every kind. The shipping of migrant armies for military objectives and the live export of animals for slaughter in countries where there are no welfare standards are also within the UPU's jurisdiction, and hopefully you will feel the responsibility to address them. This is because admiralty law has been stretched and misused beyond all reasonable doubt to facilitate trafficking and worse, while simultaneously the territory of our jurisdiction on the land and soil has been diminished. The black market for trafficked children and the well-documented involvement of the shadow directors of the corporate institutions really needs to be stopped too. as per the supplementary evidence. It is unfortunate that the Universal Postal Union and International Telecommunications Union have come to a point where they are only delivering the narrative of a dictatorship. They really need to resume facilitating communication between sensible, articulate, self-determining, informed, responsible and competent sovereign men and women, as time is of the essence. I insist that the Universal Postal Union takes this description to refer to all of us. At the moment, there is nowhere safe for people from the surveillance and disruption of our bodies by weaponized technological corporate entities and their extraction of our resources, energetic and physical. Already there are no common law courts, and the cost of challenging any one convenience or even grievous bodily harm inflicted on us is too high. A strong example was when Robert from the family Fico, Prime Minister for Slovakia, was shot after he rejected the World Health Organization's treaty as nonsense created by greedy pharmaceutical companies. Extraordinarily, the corporate media communications channels were allowed to declare the assassin a lone wolf. Robert himself was described as a populist, although he's been re-elected for countless years. The thing that had driven Robert to defend the people from the corporate institutions in the first places was when the corporate media communication channels were allowed to report that everyone unvaccinated should squeal in pain like a pig. If the media and are commercial enterprises too, which I'm sure they are, would you be sure to put the lawful assemblies in control of them as well, to help the spread of the public announcements in regard to the end of war, governments and fraud? It is a continual perpetuation of the lies for the media to be allowed to paint a derogatory picture of the man Robert and then portray pharmaceutical and medical as miraculous interventions as having kept him alive. This is especially when the most likely scenario is that the pharmaceutical companies were the ones who hired a hitman to threaten his life in the first place, and also the ones who want to create stories that support their business plans for One Health and mRNA drugs. This is a pivotal moment in history, and you, Masahiko, will have to be the man to declare all contracts void and diplomatic immunity withdrawn on grounds of protracted criminal misconduct. I believe that the Universal Postal Union's universal service obligation makes the straightforward dissemination of information between ourselves possible. We do not consent to anybody having any special legal right to invade our privacy with surveillance and yet protect their intellectual property, products and activities from regulation. We do not recognise any authority on any matter by anybody that does not understand that they are employed by us, answerable to us, and required to demonstrate their loyalty and benefit to us. Anybody who wants immunity from the law should be immediately refused it, as suspect. Anybody who wants exemption from inquiry must be immediately disqualified from holding a public office. How have you, the men and women employed at the Universal Postal Union, let us get into this situation, do you think? Most recently, your fellow countrymen in Japan are desperate to warn Japan and the world beyond Japan that lethal self-assembling vaccines are being manufactured there. They're being produced in Japan in sufficient numbers to administer to every man, woman and child in the world, as if the technology has received some sort of approval when it hasn't. The Japanese doctors and lawyers have no platform, no communication network, and no authority to stop the dangerous commercial plan. Every single government official has received money to let it go ahead. Patent law and diplomatic immunity will protect the pharmaceutical companies and implementers from liability when that distribution happens. It might well be that the Universal Postal Network is even helping with their logistics. The destruction of lives and near destruction of inalienable rights has already happened and been stepped up during COVID, so we need business, money, education, health and interaction to take place again on the land. Hard copies of our knowledge need to be stored and preserved too. The Swiss-based megalomaniacs and their agents in every country really do need to be taken down. GDPR, intellectual property, patent law, and the extreme digital verifications only serve the technocratic agenda. It must be publicly acknowledged that independent scientific inquiry has been blocked and hostile deployments of technologies as experiments and emergency use have been facilitated by exercising commercial intellectual property rights. The full funds designated to the Universal Service Obligation in 2022 were misspent on military surveillance and data harvesting masks, and the International Telecommunications Union and intergovernmental offices call them logistics. Logistics actually convey something or someone to where they need to go. Weapons of mass destruction beyond human understanding. Many of the weapons of mass destruction are beyond our human understanding. Even experts in any one field of research have no idea how their technology will interact with the countless others and with the vital processes, microbiome, and lives going on in the same vicinity. They must be decommissioned, and decontamination can be managed by the Institution for Responsible Technology and their contributors. You, the man Masahiko, in your capacity as Director General of the Universal Postal Union, must make it clear that you understand that digital communication and media have been hijacked and weaponized to manipulate the people. Public announcements making people aware of the social engineering will help people snap out of the oppression. The power to grant privileges and indemnity to international organisations has also turned out to be a weapon of mass destruction. As a result of the United Nations Convention 70 years ago, the activities of these corporate institutions and mercenary armies now lie outside the laws of the land. We the people did not and do not consent to unelected corporate psychopaths and puppets being given diplomatic immunity to commit genocide. Really, a lot of people have been killed, but no one wants to accept liability for it. We are all ambassadors of the land jurisdiction. I suggest that the law of diplomatic immunity is the opposite of enacted. To acknowledge our jurisdiction, every man, woman and child should be afforded all necessary assistance and protection in passing freely as we travel, as is our right granted to us by natural law. This uniform recognition of everyone as a responsible international ambassador ensures respect between people and nations. This will create the conditions we need for peace to increase productivity and recover ourselves as we detox from the fear messaging and biological corruption. Appreciation for the solvency and authority of the UPU over commerce. I cannot overstate how grateful I am to have recourse to the Universal Postal Union. Following the erosion and closure of all other avenues of justice and good practice, I humbly applaud you at the UPU for having remained solvent and in a position to fulfil your service for over 150 years. The mea culpa. That's that self-blame decree. All national and international organisations, principals and agents, including courts, must be brought back under the laws of the people on the land. When the Universal Postal Union issue the mea culpa, they will be leading by example, and that means you, Masahiko, will have raised awareness, notified people as to what needs to happen and why, and managed this matter in a non-confrontational way. So A, communication, and B, jurisdiction are the UPU's responsibility. My status correction from the person, corporate fiction created to take on debts, to living woman had to be Universal Postal Union registered. Each formal notice from removing my property from the land registry and withdrawing my consent to be governed and taking my name off the voting register has had to be UPU registered. This means sent by registered post. The UPU is the only service agreed and upheld by treaty that people have been able to use to register and prove our living status. So many people do not have access to this service though, and so that is why I ask you and Marjan from the Oswald family to formalise and circulate the facts of our dominion and revocation of all contracts. return land law above admiralty law. So 1. The UPU must commit to correcting the status of the entire human race from that of persons dead and lost at sea, whose property belongs to the state. 2. Living men and women with higher jurisdiction than all courts, governments, public servants, corporations, and establish our full allodial title to our environment, property, home, and bodies. Raise awareness that bank credits and government taxes are fraudulent. So 2. Pass a decision that the banking and government fraud and financial enslavement of people through taxes, usury debt, the use of Roman civil procedure is to be outlawed since the end of the Vatican rule in 2015, and their court decisions on the return of the borrowed family heirlooms by the banks must be upheld. Admit the UPU's extended facilitation of commercial courts and support the forming of lawful rural assemblies in their stead. Please send word to all postmasters that no further post should be delivered that denies our living status by being addressed to our legal fictional names that were criminally attributed to us at birth, so that we can be traded as assets but notified only of debts. 5. The UPU must apologise for threatening to drop its USO, Universal Service Obligation, and reassure everyone that reliable postal services are on their way to every community once again, being acknowledged as an important area of the postal district by ensuring the postal and logistics services will support people in communities and whole countries that have been kept poor to start again. Even people whose homes have been destroyed and people who have been held captive can be invited to use the reopened post offices as safe places of collection and connection. Current problems for the Universal Postal Service. The intergovernmental networks and delegates will have to be notified of the dismantling of restricted universal postal unions, making contracts to promote the commercial activity of smaller groups of countries, which is what restricted universal postal unions are, inevitably led to privileges for them and reduced services to others, when all commercial and administrative activities should be able to be carried out in broad daylight, making the single postal territory an equal playing field. The restricted universal postal unions and plenipotentiary extraordinary ambassadors with their executive powers to make decisions independently of their nation's leader and government have no doubt led to special treatment to benefit the few, and even facilitate hostile practices like, for example, the debilitating of Africa's postal service with corruption, breakdown and closure of services in Africa. It is no coincidence that American and Chinese officials have spoken about keeping Africa poor, so that their population declines and their rich natural resources be made available. Yes, there has been this law in African countries requiring businesses to exclusively use post office services, despite the corrupt and unreliability. But in the wider matter, we need the system and institutions implicated and powers removed first, and individual coercions answered for as secondary matters. How the corporations have tried to humiliate and mutilate the people. Within the mea culpa, it would be useful to use the post office scandal in England as first-hand experience by the Universal Postal Union that technology is fallible, and when it has gone wrong and how it has harmed people severely. The Horizon and Fujitsu system had a full technical support team, which with UPU authority falsely claimed that each post office who reported failure of the end-of-day accounts to tally was an isolated incident of theft by the postmaster, him or herself. It was not even considered that the computer system had not worked. It was not admitted that the technical team themselves had access to the post office accounts and had adjusted them manually. To question the postmaster's competence is one thing, but for the post office to convict them of theft was extremely damning. As I was saying, some of those postmasters killed themselves, and this is a microcosm of the worldwide fraud and burdens of fraudulent debt allegedly owed by people and countries with no way of paying them back. I intend to add my fee schedule at the end alongside my post office state savings account number to receive compensation and disbursement. Some of these payments I want to disperse to various trusted charities and groups, but I will enjoy doing that when it happens and not get their hopes up for financial support before their settlement arrives. On the topic of post office savings accounts, how does the Universal Postal Union envisage the shift that the World Economic Forum and United Nations agenda are pushing for a central bank digital currency? What recourse will men and women have to challenge discrepancy in their accounts, let alone make a lawful challenge against financial institutions themselves when access can be denied instantaneously and permanently? Let's make sure that independent purchases in cash are always facilitated. The Federal Supreme Court did not provide remedy. I am very grateful that the Universal Postal Union is so long established that it precedes governments, and that means that the seats of all governments remain under the direction of the Postmaster General. I am thankful also that the formation of the Universal Postal Union in 1874 had another legal effect that is very important to the universal legal technology. As you know, it is the Universal Postal Union that unites member countries into a single worldwide postal territory. When I submitted an appeal on behalf of all living men, women, animals and all natural living things to the Federal Supreme Court in Lausanne, Switzerland, I knew as a litigant I was going into international jurisdiction and needed to establish that my papers were official, so I used British postage stamp on the face of the first page and the reverse of all the pages of documents I introduced into the court system. The stamps also invoked postal statutes and the Universal Postal Union jurisdiction. The authority of the UPU was automatically invoked by the use of postage stamps. Autographing the stamps made me the postmaster of the contract. I have sent all important documentation through post office rather than through private carriers, which are the firewalls, in order to make sure I have direct access to the authority and corresponding availability of remedy and recourse of the UPU. As I posted through the Royal Mail on the 8th of April 2024, and the Royal Mail postmaster did not provide me with the remedy I requested within 21 days, I am relieved to bring the matter to the UPU. As the man Yves Gonzalez, acting as Federal Supreme Judge, had received the appeal by registered post, he will have known that the master of the contract was the post office, and the overlord of all commerce, postal service and banking systems of the world is the Universal Postal Union. I planned, when I placed autographed stamps on the documents, to place the document and the contract underlying it under international law and treaty, with which the courts have no jurisdiction to deal. Although the system cannot deal with the real me, the living principle, neither can officials, attorneys or judges go against the Universal Postal Union as the overseer of all world commerce. Thankfully, neither do the courts have the authority or jurisdiction to impair a contract between I, Francis, the living principle, and the UPU. There's hope for us yet.